Hi, beautiful people. Welcome to the Fort Salem Library, where we read you your fanfiction. So sit down or don't, relax or don't, and enjoy these stories in a way you have not before. We at Fort Salem Library do not own Motherland Fort Salem or any of the related characters. The Motherland Fort Salem series is created by Elliot Lawrence and owned by Freeform. This story is a work of fanfiction and is meant for entertainment only. We are not making any profit from these stories. All rights of the original Motherland Fort Salem story belong to Freeform. We also do not own Her Song is a Sin, or any of its original characters and storylines. We did, however, get permission from the author to read their story. This story was created and written by Lou1, and you can find the link in our show notes. This story is being read to you by me, Britt. Her Song is a Sin. Chapter 3. Riel cursed as she marched outside. Beyond the French door, she found herself on a small patio, with the only exit a winding stone footpath surrounded by flowers on either side. She had to stifle a sneeze after only walking a few feet. In several places the flowers had taken over the stone walkway, and she awkwardly found herself stepping over the various plants and nearly twisting her ankle again. Feeling the sharp pain streaking up her leg, she gritted her teeth. What is it with all these fucking flowers? Riel followed the path up the hill to her car. She had known it would be a mistake to come to Scylla Ramshorn's mansion. She didn't take celebrity cases for a reason. They were snooty, indifferent, and distractingly gorgeous, the voice in her head supplied. She reached her car and jerked open the door when the sound of running feet made her look up. "Riel, wait!" Isadora huffed, trying to catch her breath as she half-jogged a few final feet to catch up to the blonde before she could leave. "You lied," Riel said. It wasn't an accusation, but a fact. She didn't even know who I was. And as silly as it was, Riel didn't want to admit to herself just how much that bothered her. Ducking her head, Isadora had the sense to look ashamed. "Look, Scylla needs a professional bodyguard. But she'll never admit to it. I thought if she met you, saw you, then the two of you would be able to work it out yourselves. Because I fit in so well with her crew," Riel mimicked the air quotes that Ramshorn had used earlier. "Yeah, that worked out great. Thanks a lot." "Please," Byron pleaded, coming up alongside Isadora. "My sister needs your help." Riel shook her head at the pair. "It's obvious that she doesn't feel that way." Scylla's manager and brother shared a look, and then Isadora spoke up. "Please, Riel, let me show you something. You came all this way and agreed to make an assessment. At least look at everything before you make a decision." Riel sighed, eager to get off of Scylla Ramshorn's property. "Fine, but show me here. I'm not going back in there." Isadora faltered for a second, and then acquiesced. "I'll just be a few minutes." Riel closed her car door and stood beside Byron. Unable to resist her curiosity, she asked, "So what's up with all the plans?" Byron glanced at the blonde before looking away. "Scylla likes them." "Uh-huh," Riel answered. "It's all a bit much, though. You need a landscaper or a groundskeeper or something." "We have one," Byron said. Riel looked all around her and then back to Byron in disbelief. "Who?" "Helen Graves," Byron replied. Riel snorted. "She does a shit job." Byron shrugged. "That's why Scylla likes her." Riel looked at Scylla's brother for a moment, considering what he'd said, and shook her head. She didn't get it, but she felt that there was something there to get. It niggled just at the back of her mind. They stood there in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, until Garrett walked up to them. "So, Isadora said you were military?" he asked, without even a hint of an apology for what had happened in the mansion. "That's right, MP," Riel answered, unconsciously shifting into an alert posture. Byron looked at the blonde when she answered, but didn't speak. He could tell that she didn't like the publicist. and he didn't want Garrett to run Rael off before she had all the facts about his sister's situation. Still, he felt the blonde could handle him, and Scylla too, if she'd just take the job. Garrett seemed to be hoping for the opposite as he continued to goad her. "Just one tour of duty, though. Why?" "I'd rather not discuss it," Rael answered. "Have you ever killed anyone?" Garrett pushed. Rael met his gaze, her eyes steel. "I know how to get the job done when necessary." "So are you married?" Rael scoffed. "Yeah, we're not talking about that." Garrett gave up his interrogation with a shrug. "Okay." Rael hoped her deliberately poor manners would make the publicist take the hint to leave, but she was wrong. Since she didn't participate in the Q&A the publicist had started, and Ramshorn's brother didn't seem to have anything else to say, Garrett started talking. Some people just couldn't stand the silence. Apparently, he was one of those types. As Garrett droned on about the celebrities he'd met and people he'd worked with, Rael seriously thought about pulling her gun and shooting him. Just draw, shoot. A bullet straight through his frontal lobe and into his cerebral cortex. At this close of range, his head will explode like a watermelon. He won't even have time to realize what happened. Her mind entertained the image of spattering brain fragments, and she allowed herself a small smile. Of course, Rael would never do it. Despite the little fantasy, Rael despised the violence that people inflicted on others, and although she'd felt no regret for the violence she herself had to inflict at times, she took no pleasure in ending a life. Her pleasure came from saving others, and the more desperate or unusual their situation, the more Rael was in her element. Byron caught Rael's smile and returned it with a wink. He knew that Garrett was an ass and completely full of himself. It was practically a prerequisite for the job that he did. Still, he'd helped his sister rise to fame, distracting her from the death of her parents, and Byron liked him for that, even though there had been other consequences. Finally, Rael said to herself as she watched Isadora return, carrying something in her arms. She walked over to Rael and handed her a thick manila envelope. Rael tested its weight and then walked over to the hood of the car. The others followed and they surrounded the hood of the Subaru. Rael pulled out a sheet of paper and some photos. Dropping the paper and envelope on the hood, she turned her attention to the photographs. Her eyes widened as she flipped through the photos. Rael felt a strange sense of déjà vu, and it was like something out of one of her old case briefings. Gruesome images filled with blood and death were prominently displayed picture after picture. "Where did you get these?" "They were found attached to the windshield of the limo she was riding in a couple of weeks ago. The one I told you about on the phone," Isadora explained. Rael's head tilted to the side, and her mind raced, trying to recall the multiple conversations she had had with the older woman. "You never told me about any photographs. You just mentioned a note." "I wanted to make sure you would come here first," Isadora admitted. Rael looked back down at the photo in her hand. Through the blood and gore, Rael could just make out the figure of a naked woman. Something wasn't quite right with the photos other than the obvious, but Rael couldn't quite put her thumb on what was wrong. The woman had been badly mutilated, and it looked like something was carved on her chest, but despite squinting, she couldn't quite make it out. Grimly, Rael shook her head, eyes still focused on the picture. "Well, I'm here now." The next photo showed a close-up of a woman's torso. The word sexy had been etched across the chest area. She continued flipping through the photos until she came to the final image showing the body dumped in shallow grave. She looked closely at the ground surrounding the grave, looking for any telling signs of a location when it hit her. All of the photos were missing the markers used to catalog evidence. She wasn't looking at some stolen crime scene photos. These had been taken before the police had arrived. How was the envelope attached to the windshield? It was stuck under one of the wipers. The driver didn't try to take this with him? "No," Byron answered. "With the tires slashed, I thought that whatever was there might be bad like the last time. So I grabbed it and hid it before he could notice that it was even there. Besides, all the driver cared about was the tires." "Last time?" Rael asked. Isadora and Byron shared a look. Garrett shifted beside them and spoke up. "She's got a couple of other notes like the one with the envelope. It started about 3 months ago." Rael dropped the photos on the hood of her car and turned her attention to the note. The author had used cutouts of block letters from magazines to create a message that explained in graphic detail how Scylla Ramshorn would die. "Do you still have the other notes?" Rael asked, going back through everything but not finding anything else. "No, I tossed them out. I thought it was just sick fan stuff. Every time Scylla's in a magazine or comes out with new music, there's always a bunch of mail. Some of it is pretty nasty." "But like this?" Rael prodded. "Just a couple of notes," Garrett insisted. "And the doll," Byron added. Rael's brow furrowed and she looked to the lanky man. "What doll?" "We should show her," Byron answered, looking at Isadora. Beside them, Garrett rolled his eyes. "Do we really need to do this? We don't need this shit. It's a distraction." Rael frowned at Byron. "Show me in a minute. I want to talk about these photos and the note. You should have given them to the police immediately." "Why? It's not like anyone was hurt," Garrett answered for Byron, folding his arms defensively. Rael turned to the publicist. "What about her?" she asked, thrusting one of the photos in his face. He stepped back at the gruesome image and muttered, "Haven't you ever heard of Photoshop?" "Photoshop," Rael spat, barely containing her rising anger. "Yeah. Those have got to be fake. Just some fucked up shit a sicko fan came up with. You can do all kinds of stuff with photo edits. People post edits on Twitter all the time." "The pictures are fake, aren't they?" Byron asked. His voice sounded hopeful, but his face betrayed him. And it was obvious that even he didn't believe Garrett's attempt to explain away the gruesome images. After all, they had called her here for help, and Rael only worked for people whose life was in danger. Rael looked apologetically at Scylla's older brother and attempted to control her temper. "It's possible, but I seriously doubt it. This looks real. I won't know for sure, though, until they are professionally assessed." The blonde put everything back into the envelope and dropped it on the hood of her car. She looked up at Byron and Isadora. "You mentioned a doll?" Isadora handed Rael a small doll from her pocket while beside her Garrett groaned his displeasure. Rael took the doll, turning it this way and that in her hand. It resembled a knockoff Barbie brand. Surprisingly, it bore a striking resemblance to Scylla. It even had blue eyes. There was a tiny witch hat fastened to the doll's head, and a noose hung around its neck. She quirked her brow at the oddity. Rael unfolded a small paper pinned to the doll and read the message. It was a similar style as the note, block letters, though the message was about Scylla being a witch. The point of the note was the same, though. Scylla Ramshorn should die. "Where did you get this?" Rael asked. "We found it in her home studio," Isadora answered. Somebody got into the house? But of course they did, Rael thought. She had seen how easy it would be. There were dozens of ways to get inside the Ramshorn's home. What if the next time they show up with a gun or a knife instead of a sick gift and a note? Byron nodded, taking the doll back from Rael and looking at it as he spoke. "We went out with some of my friends for lunch, and when we got back, Scylla told me she'd had an idea she wanted to jot down. She asked me if I would go get her music notebook for her while she got us something to drink. When I got to the studio, I noticed that the door was open. We always keep it locked because some of the instruments in there were our part." Byron stopped for a second, looking up from the doll to Rael, a pained expression forming on his face. He shook his head and then continued. "Well, some of the instruments are delicate, and we don't want just anyone getting in there and possibly breaking them. Anyway, I found the doll and the note on the piano." "Could someone here have let themselves into the studio?" Rael asked. "A maid, cleaning, maybe?" Byron shook his head. "No one else has a key to the studio but Scylla and me." Rael looked at Isadora and Garrett, who both nodded their agreement. "No one goes in there unless Scylla or Byron is with them," Isadora confirmed. "They don't even let me in," Garrett huffed. "Scylla had the opportunity to be in a photo spread of musicians and their creative spaces in Pitchfork last Christmas, and she refused. We had to create a mock-up studio down the hall to be photographed." "Pitchfork?" Rael asked, brow furrowed. "Seriously?" Garrett gasped at her. "It's a music blog," Isadora explained. "It's the music blog," Garrett corrected. "Fuck, Isadora. What rock did you lift up to find her hiding under?" Rael rolled her eyes. I don't care about that stuff. She turned her attention back to Byron. Are you absolutely certain you or Miss Ramshorn didn't accidentally leave the studio unlocked? Absolutely, Byron insisted. So the lock was picked? Riel pressed. It must have been, Byron answered. Riel bit the inside of her cheek. She stood there for a moment, thinking about all that she'd heard and all that Isadora had left out of their conversations. Let me see if I've got this straight, Riel began, ticking items off with her fingers as she spoke. 3 months ago, she started getting letters with death threats. Next, someone breaks into the house and leaves her a doll with a note calling her a witch and threatening to kill her in what you people are calling the most sacred space. Then someone slashed the tires of a limo that Miss Ramshorn's riding in and leaves a note and photographs of a probable murder victim for her to find. Riel folded her arms and looked at the 3 people standing around her car. You people have a serious problem here. That's what I've been trying to tell you. Please, will you help us? Isadora asked. Riel sighed and looked over toward the house. Her eyes caught movement from an upstairs balcony and she could see Scylla staring down at them. Even from this distance, Riel could feel the pull of the brunette's azure eyes, and she had to resist focusing on them. Everything that she'd been told and seen suggested that Mrs. Ramshorn's safety was at serious risk. So why was the musician so flippant about having a bodyguard? Was she in denial? Because if she was, Riel knew how dangerous that could be, and how much harder it would make her job to protect the brunette. Riel jerked her head towards the balcony. What does she say about this? Byron looked down at the doll in his hand, and Isadora glared at Garrett, who finally spoke up. We didn't want to freak her out. Riel's jaw dropped, and the publicist continued defensively. Besides, I still think it's some kind of a hoax. What? Riel asked, looking at them in disbelief. You mean she doesn't know about this? No, Isadora replied finally. None of it, Riel asked. We wanted to protect her, Byron supplied. Riel looked at them incredulously. Protect her, Riel scoffed. You people don't know anything about safety or security. Well, knowing all this would really fuck her up, wouldn't it? Garrett spat. Riel was infuriated at their deliberate ignorance. It bordered on arrogance. She tried to remember that these people were a little eccentric. Celebrities and their ilk always were, but come on. Riel attempted to keep her voice even as she asked, how do you expect her to take this seriously when she doesn't know what's happening? Garrett rolled his eyes and threw up his hands. Fuck me. We don't need this kind of shit this close to the award season. Just go. We'll handle it our own way. Yeah, you've done a bang-up job so far, Riel shot back. Byron opened his mouth as if to speak and then closed it again. Garrett folded his arms and stared at Riel. I'll tell her, Isadora offered, breaking their standoff. I can't protect her if she doesn't know the threat, Riel said, pressing the importance of the issue. I mean, she has to have some responsibility for her own life. Isadora nodded. I'll make her understand. She'll be cooperative. No, I'll do it, Garrett insisted. I'll go tell her. Riel watched as the publicist huffed off towards the towering mansion. Byron swallowed a few times, his Adam's apple bobbing. He looked like he was on the verge of tears. Please, Miss Caller. I know that she's difficult to deal with sometimes, and she can be a royal bitch when she wants to. But she's my sister, and I love her. She's all that I have. Please say you'll do this. Riel nodded her head, even though she knew instinctively that she was going to regret this. Yeah, I'll do it. Isadora smiled and grabbed Riel's hand, shaking it furiously. I promise she won't be any trouble. Riel rolled her eyes and reclaimed her hand from Isadora. Oh, she'll be trouble. Well, no job is perfect, Isadora admitted. Byron smiled, the relief visible on his face. Things won are done. Joy's soul lies in the doing. Riel stared blankly at him and he chuckled. Shakespeare. Ah, sure. Riel picked up the envelope from her hood and put her hand out for the doll. After a few seconds, Byron gave it to the blonde. I'm going to take these with me and show them to an old friend of mine who's working with the FBI now. Byron surged forward and wrapped his arms around Riel in a hug. Thank you for taking the job. The blonde froze in place and said nothing. Eventually, the lanky man stepped away and with a shy wave turned and walked back toward the mansion. Isadora offered Rael a small shrug. "You'll get used to them." "Yeah," Rael answered, and wondered again why in the world Isadora ever felt she'd fit in with Scylla Ramshorn and her crew. "All right," Isadora said brightly. "Well, whenever you're ready, just swing back by with your things and one of the maids will get the guest house set up for you. Is there anything you need to get started?" Rael nodded to Isadora. "Let's start with the plans and blueprints of the grounds and the house. I'll also need a list of all Miss Ramshorn's staff." Rael looked over at Isadora. "You want to maybe write this down?" "Nah," Isadora answered, tapping her temple. "I'll remember it, and it's Scylla. She'll go nuts if she constantly hears you calling her Miss Ramshorn." Rael shook her head, aggravated by the silliness of people insisting on informalities. Still, if that small concession on her part would elicit some cooperation from the musician, she'd give it a try just this once. "Fine. I need a list of all the staff working here and associated with Scylla in any way. That means all her friends, lovers, nearest neighbors, and acquaintances." "That will be a short list," Isadora said. "Anything else?" "What else?" Rael thought. "Oh, a copy of her calendar schedule would be great. I can get you a paper copy, but it will be easier just to link you the electronic schedule I have on my phone. One more thing. I want an assistant. Someone on her staff will do." Rael bit her lip, wondering how Isadora would feel about her final request. Isadora's eyes widened for a moment, and then she nodded as Rael moved to the driver's door of her car. "Is there anyone in particular that you want from the staff?" Rael shrugged. "Who's driving her new limo?" "Helen Graves," Isadora answered. "Let's hope she drives better than she landscapes." Isadora's brows shot up, but she didn't comment. "She'll do." Rael laughed at Isadora's expression as she got into the car and started the engine. Almost as an afterthought, the blonde looked back up at Isadora. "We need to keep this out of the press." "I know." Nodding, Rael said, "I'll be back here tomorrow by 6. "Rael, thanks again," Isadora said as the blonde shifted her car into gear. Byron found Scylla sitting in a chair in her room and reading a book. She had changed out of the blouse and slacks and wore a t-shirt and jogging pants. Her hair was back in a ponytail. Byron was glad to see that she was already in her in-for-the-night wardrobe. That meant he wouldn't have to worry about her going out. He hoped now that Rael had agreed to take the job, Scylla would at least be safe when she did venture out. Maybe the blonde's presence would also help to curb some of her antics. He walked over and plopped down on her bed. Without looking up, Scylla asked, "Well?" "Well, Porter and Garrett really pissed her off, but she's going to do it. All it took was a little of my Ramshorn charm to convince her," Byron bragged. Scylla let the book fall to her lap and looked up at her brother with a sigh. She wouldn't admit it, but a part of her was glad she'd get the chance to see the blonde again, while the other part dreaded the invasion of her personal privacy. "Thank you ever so much for that," Scylla answered, flashing her brother a grin that dripped with sarcasm. "Come on, Syl. You know you need Rael's help. Porter never knew what he was doing." "He cares, though," Scylla said, defending one of her only childhood friends. "Yeah, he cares too much," Byron muttered. Scylla shrugged, not wanting to rehash an old argument. She could handle Porter, she always had. "So when does she start?" the brunette asked, changing the subject. Just then, Byron's cell phone rang, and he hopped up from the bed and made his way to the door so he could take the call. On his way out, he looked back at his sisters and grinned. Isadora said she'd be here bright and early tomorrow, so you'd better be ready to play nice. "Just great," Scylla responded, and returned to her book. Half an hour later, she threw it down on the floor. She'd been reading the same page over and over as her thoughts kept drifting back to a certain blonde bodyguard. "My bodyguard," she thought with a smile. Please find the fanfiction you just listened to on Archive of Our Own, and leave the author some love. Without them, this wouldn't be possible, and we want to thank them from the bottoms of our hearts for creating these amazing stories and keeping the show alive.